The transport ship Meridian shuddered again, and Lisa Morgan held her baby daughter tighter against her chest. Emma was only 6 months old, too young to understand that they were dying in the cold darkness of space. The ship's engines had failed 3 days ago, leaving 300 colonists stranded between star systems with no help coming fast enough. Lisa could see her breath now in the passenger compartment. The crew was shutting down heating to save power for the cryopods, the only chance anyone had of surviving until rescue arrived. Lisa had been traveling alone to the New Horizons colony where a job waited for her in the agricultural division. Her husband had died 2 years ago in a mining accident, and she was starting over with their daughter. Now she wondered if either of them would see another sunrise. The other passengers huddled together in small groups, their faces pale with cold and fear. Some were crying. Others sat in silence, holding their loved ones close. Captain Helen Ross appeared on the intercom, her voice steady but heavy with bad news. There were only enough working cryopods for half the passengers. The pods were old, and many had stopped functioning when the power failed. Priority would go to families with young children, but even that was not a guarantee of safety. Some pods were damaged and might not work properly. Some people would sleep and wake up when rescue came. Some would sleep and never wake up at all. Lisa felt her heart sink as crew members began moving through the compartments, checking names against lists and directing people toward the cryo bay. A young woman in a crew uniform stopped beside her seat. The woman's name tag said Kelly, and her eyes were red from crying. She checked her tablet and looked at Lisa with an expression that made Lisa's stomach twist with dread. Kelly's voice was soft and apologetic. Pod 47 was assigned to Lisa and Emma, but there was a problem with it. The temperature regulation system was damaged and flickering on and off. The pod might keep them frozen properly until rescue came, or it might freeze them too fast and kill them, or it might warm up too soon and they would die anyway. Kelly wiped her eyes and said she was sorry, but there were no other pods available. It was the damaged pod or nothing at all. Lisa looked down at Emma, who was wrapped in 3 blankets and sleeping peacefully in her arms. She thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, all the decisions that seemed so important just days ago. None of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was giving her daughter a chance to live, even if that chance was small. Around her, Lisa could see other families making impossible choices. An elderly couple in the seats across from her stood up and walked over to a pregnant woman sitting alone. They told her to take their pod. The woman tried to refuse, but the old man just smiled and said they had lived good long lives and her baby deserved a chance to live one too. Lisa watched the pregnant woman cry as she hugged them both, then followed a crew member toward the cryo bay. A man in his 30s was saying goodbye to his wife near the front of the compartment. They had 3 children, and there was only one working pod for the family. The man was going into the pod with the kids while his wife stayed awake. She kissed him and told him she loved him, her voice breaking as she tried to be brave for the children. The oldest child, a girl maybe 8 years old, was crying and begging her mother to come with them. The woman knelt down and hugged her daughter, promising that everything would be fine, that she would see them soon. Lisa felt tears running down her face as she watched these moments of love and sacrifice happening all around her. Humans could be terrible sometimes, cruel and selfish and mean, but when everything fell apart and death came knocking, humans could also be the most beautiful thing in the universe. They gave up their own lives so others could survive. They said goodbye with courage even when their hearts were breaking. They held on to hope even when there was almost none left. Kelly returned and told Lisa it was time. Lisa gathered Emma's few belongings, including a small stuffed rabbit that had been a gift from Lisa's mother. She followed Kelly through the cold corridors to the cryo bay, where rows of white pods lined the walls like coffins. Some pods were already sealed with families inside, frost forming on the transparent lids. Other pods stood empty and dark, their systems too broken to use. Pod 47 was near the back. Kelly opened the lid and checked the controls one more time, her hands shaking. The temperature display flickered between numbers, unable to settle on a stable reading. Kelly looked at Lisa and apologized again, saying she wished there was another option. Lisa just nodded and climbed into the pod with Emma held against her chest. The pod was barely big enough for one adult, and Lisa had to curl around her daughter to fit them both inside. She wrapped Emma in every blanket she had, tucking them tight around the baby's small body. She placed the stuffed rabbit beside Emma's head. Then Lisa pulled out her phone and recorded a message, just in case Emma survived and she did not. She told her daughter she loved her more than anything in the world. She told her to be strong and brave. She told her that her mother had tried everything possible to save her. Kelly's face appeared above the pod, tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached down and squeezed Lisa's hand for a moment, then stepped back and activated the pod. The lid began to close slowly. Lisa took one last look at the cryo bay, at all the other families trapped in their failing pods, gambling their lives on broken machines in desperate hope. The lid sealed with a hiss. Lisa felt the temperature drop immediately, much faster than it should have. The pod was malfunctioning already. She held Emma close and closed her eyes, praying to any god or force in the universe that might be listening. She prayed that her baby would survive even if she did not. She prayed that someone would find them before it was too late. She prayed that Emma would grow up and have a good life and know that her mother had loved her with everything she had. The frost crept across the inside of the lid. Lisa's breath came slower and slower. Emma stirred in her arms but did not wake. The cold sank deeper into Lisa's bones and she felt herself slipping away into darkness. The last thing she heard before consciousness faded was the sound of the pod systems whining and clicking, struggling to work properly, and failing just like everything else on the dying ship. Lisa felt warmth before she felt anything else. It was solid and real, pressed against her back and wrapped around both her and Emma. She could hear breathing that was not her own, steady and deep and much too slow to be her baby daughter. Something was wrong with this picture, but her mind was too foggy to understand what it was. Her eyes refused to open at first. The lids felt heavy and crusted with ice crystals. She forced them to work, blinking slowly as her vision cleared bit by bit. The first thing she saw was Emma in her arms, still wrapped in all the blankets, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The baby was alive. They were both alive. Lisa's heart surged with relief so strong it almost hurt, but something was very wrong. They were not in the cryopod anymore. Lisa turned her head slowly and saw they were lying on a floor inside a small emergency shelter, the kind used for planetside camps when colonists first landed. Thermal blankets covered them in layers. A portable heating unit hummed in the corner, its display showing it had been running for hours. And behind her, providing the human warmth she had felt first, was a man. He was awake. Lisa realized this with a start. His breathing was controlled and deliberate, not the deep sleep of someone resting. He had been awake this whole time, using his own body heat to warm her and Emma back up from the dangerous cold of the failing cryopod. How long had he been lying there keeping them alive? Lisa tried to speak, but her throat was raw and painful. She managed a small sound, and immediately the warmth behind her shifted. The man moved carefully, slowly extracting himself from the pile of blankets so he would not disturb Emma. When Lisa finally managed to turn her head enough to see him properly, she took in his appearance with confusion and gratitude. He looked about 40 years old with tired blue eyes and several days' worth of beard growth on his face. He wore a civilian jumpsuit that was stained and torn in several places. His hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages that looked like strips of cloth torn from someone's shirt. He looked like he had not slept in days, and Lisa realized with a shock that he probably had not slept at all. The man held up his bandaged hands in a peaceful gesture when he saw Lisa looking at him with wide eyes. His voice was hoarse but gentle when he spoke. He told her to take it easy, that she had been unconscious for about 6 hours since he got the cryopod open. He explained that Emma had never fully gone under because the pod failed right away, and he had been keeping the baby warm while Lisa's body temperature came back up to safe levels. Lisa's arms tightened around Emma instinctively. She did not know this man. He could be anyone, but he noticed her reaction and understood it. Keeping his distance and speaking in a calm tone to show he meant no harm, he introduced himself as Jake Collins, a maintenance engineer who had been doing emergency repairs when the cryopod started failing. He said her pod was about to freeze both her and Emma to death, so he pulled them out and brought them here. He had been monitoring them both ever since, making sure their body temperatures rose slowly enough to be safe. Lisa had so many questions flooding her mind, but the most important one forced its way out of her damaged throat first. She asked about the ship, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jake's expression darkened and he was quiet for a moment before answering. He told her they needed to talk about the situation, but first he wanted to get her some water because she was badly dehydrated, and if she was nursing Emma, the baby would need her at full strength. Jake moved to a corner of the shelter where he had supplies stored. He came back with a bottle of water and helped Lisa sit up carefully, supporting her back while she drank. The water hurt going down, but it helped clear her head. Emma woke up and started to fuss, and Lisa began to feed her while Jake sat nearby and explained what had happened. The news was both better and worse than Lisa had feared. The good part was that the Meridian had not exploded or broken apart. The crew had managed to stabilize life support in 3 sections of the ship. About 60 people were still alive, including 27 who had made it through cryosleep successfully when their pods worked properly. The bad news made Lisa's chest tighten with fear. They were still stranded in space between star systems. The distress beacon was broadcasting, but they were in an area where few ships traveled. Rescue could take weeks or even months to arrive. Meanwhile, the ship was dying slowly around them, one system failing after another. The crew was doing everything possible to keep people alive long enough for help to come. Jake had been part of an emergency response team trying to save the failing cryopods. He explained that he had been awake for 5 straight days, running on stimulant pills and pure determination. When he found Lisa's pod in cascade failure with Emma already warming up to dangerous levels, he made a split-second decision to pull them both out. He grabbed emergency supplies and brought them to this shelter, one of several that had been set up in the cargo bays where the temperature was more stable. Lisa asked him the question that was burning in her mind. Why them? Why had he saved her and Emma when there were other people, other pods that were failing? She asked not because she was ungrateful, but because she needed to understand. Jake was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He admitted there had been others, other pods failing at the same time. He had saved who he could physically reach in the time available. Lisa and Emma were the 3rd rescue he made. The first was a 10-year-old boy. The second was the boy's mother. They were in another shelter 2 sections away, being looked after by a nurse named Patricia, who was helping coordinate medical care for survivors. Jake met Lisa's eyes and told her the brutal truth. He had picked the people he thought had the best chance of surviving. Parents with young children, people who had someone to fight for. He figured they would try harder to stay alive than someone alone might. It was a cold calculation, but it was the only way he could make the choice in the moment. Lisa asked about the others, the ones he could not reach in time. Jake's voice went flat and emotionless. Some of them made it when their pods warmed up too fast, but not fast enough to kill them. Some of them did not make it. The crew was doing everything possible, but resources were limited and people were dying. He had told this story before to other survivors, and each time it cost him something. Jake stood up slowly and said he needed to get back to the main sections where the crew was working. He had only stayed this long to make sure Lisa and Emma were stable and safe. Lisa looked at her daughter, warm and fed and alive in her arms. She looked at this stranger who had lost sleep and burned his hands and risked his own life to save them both. Lisa asked him what she could do to help. Jake blinked in surprise and said she had just come out of a failed cryopod and needed to rest. But Lisa shook her head and told him she was a botanist who knew systems and chemistry and life support. More importantly, she was a mother, which meant she was very motivated to help fix the ship and keep everyone alive. She told him to explain what needed to be done. For the first time since Lisa woke up, Jake Collins smiled. It was brief and exhausted, but completely real. He held out his bandaged hand to help her stand and welcomed her to the Meridian survival crew. Together, he said, they were going to save some lives. The next 72 hours showed Lisa what human beings were truly capable of when death was standing at the door. Jake led her through the inhabited sections of the Meridian, with Emma strapped to her chest in a carrier that another survivor had made from cargo netting and thermal cloth. The ship was like a dying body, and the survivors were the organs trying to keep it alive just a little longer. Captain Helen Ross was a stern woman in her 50s, who had not slept since the crisis began. She directed operations from a makeshift command center that had been set up in what used to be a storage room. When Jake brought Lisa to meet her, the captain looked up from a tablet covered in system readouts and gave Lisa a nod of respect. Jake had told her Lisa was a botanist, and Ross said they needed her in hydroponics immediately. The plants were dying, and without them, the survivors would run out of food even faster. Jake took Lisa to meet the other key people keeping everyone alive. Patricia Wong was the nurse he had mentioned, running a medical bay in a converted storage room with almost no proper supplies. She was taking care of 14 people, including 2 other babies, and the 10-year-old boy named Danny that Jake had saved. Danny's mother, Kate, stayed by his side constantly, helping Patricia with the other patients however she could. There were engineers and mechanics and civilian volunteers literally holding the ship together with improvised repairs and salvaged parts. A man named Gary, who used to be military, was keeping the life support systems running with spare parts and prayer. A woman named Amy, who was a teacher, had organized all the children and was keeping them calm and educated while their parents worked. A cargo handler named Vincent had memorized the ship's layout and was guiding people through the dark, unpowered sections. Lisa met the other survivors who were like her, people who had woken from cryosleep or avoided it entirely and refused to give up. They had organized themselves into teams without anyone telling them to do it. There was medical, engineering, resource management, childcare, food preparation, and security. Everyone had a job and everyone did it without complaining. Lisa found her place in the hydroponics bay where the emergency gardens were struggling to survive. The environmental controls were failing and the plants were dying from cold and lack of proper light. But Lisa knew plants better than most people knew anything. She knew how to coax life from minimal resources and terrible conditions. She started teaching the other volunteers how to manually pollinate the flowers because the air circulation was too weak. She showed them how to adjust soil chemistry using materials from the ship's supply stores. She explained how to maximize growth with the limited light they could provide. Within 2 days, Lisa had saved about 1/3 of the gardens from total failure. Within 4 days, she had new shoots growing from seeds she found in storage. It would not save everyone by itself, but combined with carefully rationed supplies, it might keep them alive long enough for rescue to arrive. Emma became something special to all the survivors. People were desperate for hope, and they found it in the baby who smiled and made happy sounds despite being in the middle of a crisis. When Lisa needed to work, other people took turns holding Emma and playing with her. Patricia checked the baby constantly to make sure she stayed healthy. Even Captain Ross cracked a smile when Emma reached for her with tiny hands during a briefing, but it was Jake who Emma seemed to love most. In the rare moments when he stopped working long enough to rest, he held Emma with careful, practiced hands like someone who had done this before. Lisa learned that Jake had a daughter once years ago, who died in a plague that swept through a colony. He did not talk about it much, but Lisa could see it in the way he looked at Emma, in the desperate intensity with which he fought to save the ship. One night when they shared a brief rest period, Lisa told Jake that Emma reminded him of his daughter. Jake looked at the baby sleeping in Lisa's arms and admitted it was true. But he said that was not why he pulled them out of the failing pod. He saved them because they deserved to live, because Emma deserved a chance at life. He said that giving up on children meant giving up on everything that made humans worth saving. Lisa reached out and gently squeezed Jake's bandaged hand. She thanked him for not giving up on them, for choosing to fight when it would have been easier to save himself. Jake squeezed back and they sat together in comfortable silence while Emma slept peacefully between them. On day 8 after the crisis began, the situation got worse. A critical coolant line ruptured in one of the inhabited sections, and toxic fumes forced an evacuation. The survivors crowded into even tighter quarters in the remaining safe areas. Space was so limited people could barely move. Tempers started to flare as fear and stress pushed everyone to their breaking point. But humanity's response was not to turn on each other and fight over the scraps. Instead, people dug deeper and found strength they did not know they had. Captain Ross implemented a strict rotation system where everyone worked 6 hours and then rested 6 hours with no exceptions, not even for her. Jake tried to protest that he was needed, but Gary and Vincent physically dragged him to a shelter and forced him to sleep, standing guard outside to make sure he did not sneak out and go back to work. The children started a project led by Danny, the boy Jake had saved. They collected scraps of trash and broken pieces of equipment, and under Amy's guidance they created art. They drew pictures of Earth and the stars, and the colony they were trying to reach. They decorated the shelters with messages of hope and colorful designs. It seemed silly and simple, but it mattered more than anyone expected. The adults saw what the children made and remembered why they were fighting so hard. Lisa started teaching the other parents how to care for their children in crisis conditions. She showed them how to keep kids calm when they were scared, She taught them how to make games out of rationing food so children would not realize how serious things were. She explained how to answer their questions honestly without terrifying them. Emma was living proof that babies could grow and thrive even in the worst situations. The engineers achieved something that seemed impossible. They managed to restore partial power to the communications array by cannibalizing parts from non-essential systems. The distress signal went from a weak pulse that probably nobody would hear to a strong broadcast that might actually reach someone. They did not know if anyone would respond, but the chance went from almost zero to possibly maybe. On day 12, they received an answer. The signal was faint and broken up with static, but it was definitely there. A colony ship called the Valiant had picked up their distress call. They were 5 days away if they pushed their engines to maximum. They were coming to save the Meridian. The survivors allowed themselves to hope for the first time since the crisis began. People cried and hugged each other. Some laughed with relief. Others just sat quietly and let the news sink in. They might actually survive this. They might actually live. But Captain Ross gathered everyone together in the largest shelter and gave them the hard truth. 5 days was a very long time when the ship was dying around them. They were not safe yet and could not celebrate like they were. Every single person needed to keep working and keep fighting because they had come too far to die now, when rescue was so close. The response from the survivors was immediate and unanimous. Not one person said they were giving up. Not one person said they would stop fighting. They had made it 12 days through hell and they would make it 5 more. They would survive because that is what humans do. The last 5 days before rescue were the hardest of all. Systems that had been barely functioning began to fail completely as if the ship knew help was coming and decided it could finally give up. The temperature dropped even lower in the inhabited sections. Oxygen levels started to fluctuate wildly. The survivors huddled together for warmth, shared oxygen masks when levels got too low, and rationed their last supplies down to individual molecules. On day 14, the hydroponics bay suffered a catastrophic failure that Lisa could not prevent. She watched helplessly as 2 weeks of brutal work died right in front of her eyes. The plants she had coaxed back to life withered and turned brown as the environmental system shut down completely. Lisa wanted to scream and cry and give up right there. Emma was hungry and other children were depending on the food they had been growing. But Lisa did not give up because none of them were giving up. Instead, she and her team salvaged every single edible plant they could find. They processed the plant matter, preserved what could be preserved, and distributed it evenly among all the survivors. It was not much food, but it was something, and something was better than nothing when you were starving. On day 15, Gary collapsed while repairing a critical life support node in one of the inhabited sections. His heart just gave out from exhaustion and stress and too many stimulant pills. Patricia managed to bring him back and stabilize him, but he was finished. His body could not take any more. Without being asked, 3 other survivors who had been watching Gary work stepped up to continue what he had started. They learned on the fly, making mistakes and figuring things out because there was no other choice. On day 16, the heating systems in 2 of the shelters failed at exactly the same time. The survivors in those sections had to evacuate to the remaining spaces in the middle of the night. Now people were packed in so tightly there was barely room to sit down, much less lie down to sleep, but they shared body heat by pressing close together. They shared their blankets even though everyone was freezing. They shared their hope even though hope was running dangerously low. Jake and Lisa ended up in the same shelter with Emma and about a dozen other people. They were pressed close together in a pile of bodies trying to conserve warmth. Emma slept between them, and Jake kept one hand on her back to monitor her breathing and make sure she was okay. The baby was handling the crisis better than most adults. In the dim light of the emergency lamps, Lisa spoke quietly so she would not wake the others. She told Jake that when they got out of this mess, he was going to be part of Emma's life. She said he had to know that. Jake was quiet for a long moment before saying he was not Emma's father. Lisa agreed that was true, but she pointed out that he was the man who saved them both. He was the man who kept them warm when they should have frozen to death. He was the man who fought for them when he could have just saved himself and let them die. She told him he was family now if he wanted to be. Jake's eyes filled with tears that he did not let fall. His voice was barely a whisper when he said he wanted to be family. He wanted that more than anything. Lisa smiled and squeezed his hand, and they sat together in the cold darkness while Emma slept peacefully between them. On day 17, the Valiant arrived, and it was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. The massive colony ship was 10 times bigger than the Meridian, and it appeared like a miracle in the viewport screens. Captain Robert Lane of the Valiant took one look at the state of the dying ship and immediately diverted all available resources to rescue operations. The evacuation happened in carefully organized stages. Medical cases went first, the people who were too sick or injured to wait. Patricia and Kate and Danny were among the first group transferred to the Valiant's medical bay. Then the children and their parents were evacuated. Lisa refused to leave until Emma could go with all the other children together. She wanted to show them by example that they were safe now, that they had made it. When her turn finally came, Lisa walked onto the Valiant carrying Emma in her arms. The rescue crew stared at them with expressions of awe and disbelief. They had been briefed on what happened to the Meridian, on the cryopod failures and the impossible survival against terrible odds. A crew member asked Lisa how many people made it, his voice full of wonder. Lisa told him proudly that 63 people survived, 63 people who refused to die no matter what. The rescue crews called them miracles walking. Captain Ross called them survivors and nothing more. But when Jake was finally pulled off the Meridian after making absolutely sure every last person was evacuated safely, he had a different word for what they were. A reporter from the Valiant's communications department asked him how they managed to survive. Jake looked exhausted and filthy, but his voice was strong when he answered. He said they were human, and humans did impossible things when they had to. When they had someone worth fighting for. The medical team on the Valiant could not believe what they found when they examined the survivors. Despite terrible deprivation and cold and failing systems, the Meridian survivors were in surprisingly good condition overall. They had kept each other healthy as much as possible. They had taken care of each other. They had refused to let anyone fall who could be saved. Emma was examined thoroughly and declared perfectly healthy. The doctor said it was remarkable that a baby so young had come through the crisis without any problems. Lisa was told she was malnourished and exhausted but would recover fully with rest and proper food. Jake was treated for severe sleep deprivation, chemical burns on his hands from the repair work, and about a dozen other minor injuries he had never bothered to mention to anyone. The survivors were given real quarters on the Valiant with actual beds and hot showers and as much food as they could eat. Many of them broke down and cried when they were finally in a safe place where they could let their guard down. Lisa held Emma and cried for the first time since the crisis started, letting out days and days of terror and determination and grief for the people who did not make it. Jake found her later after the medical team had cleaned him up and bandaged his hands properly. He looked almost human again instead of like an exhausted ghost. He told her the Valiant was heading to a colony called New Portland that was 3 months away. Captain Lane had said there were jobs available for all the Meridian survivors if they wanted to stay and help build the new settlement. Lisa looked at Emma, who was reaching for Jake with her chubby baby hands and making happy sounds. She smiled and said a new start sounded good to her. Jake carefully took Emma from her arms and the baby settled against his chest with complete trust. He agreed that it sounded very good. They had survived the impossible together and now they would build something new together. That was what humans did. They survived and they built and they never stopped reaching for the future. The 3-month journey to New Portland gave the Meridian survivors time to heal both body and mind. The Valiant was everything their dying ship had not been, with working systems and hot food and safety. But the survivors carried the experience with them in ways both visible and invisible. Jake's hands healed slowly, leaving scars that would never completely fade. Lisa had nightmares about ice and darkness and Emma going cold in her arms. Patricia had developed a nervous habit of checking people's vital signs even when they were obviously fine. But they also carried something else with them, something stronger than trauma. They carried the knowledge of what they had accomplished together. They had looked death in the face and refused to blink. They had kept each other alive through impossible circumstances. That kind of experience changed people down to their bones. The Valiant's crew treated them with a mixture of respect and curiosity. News of the Meridian had spread through the ship within hours of the rescue. Everyone wanted to hear the stories to understand how 63 people survived when over 200 did not. Some of the survivors were willing to talk about it. Others kept silent, processing their experience privately. Jake fell into the second category. speaking about the crisis only when directly asked and even then keeping his answers brief. Lisa found herself somewhere in the middle. She talked about the hydroponics work and the community that formed among the survivors. She talked about the children and how they had stayed hopeful even when the adults were terrified. But she did not talk about lying in the failing cryopod with Emma, about closing her eyes and accepting death. That memory was too raw, too personal to share with strangers who had not been there. Emma thrived during the journey in ways that amazed the Valiant's medical staff. The baby hit all her developmental milestones right on schedule despite the trauma she had been through. She smiled and laughed and started trying to crawl. She responded to her name and recognized faces. Patricia said it was proof that babies were more resilient than people gave them credit for. But Lisa knew the truth. Emma had survived because people had fought for her. She had thrived because she was surrounded by love. Jake spent more and more time with Lisa and Emma as the journey continued. At first it was just helping out when Lisa needed a break or someone to hold the baby while she showered. But gradually it became something deeper and more significant. Jake started showing up at mealtimes to eat with them. He brought Emma little toys he found or made from spare parts. He made faces that made the baby laugh until she had hiccups. He sang to her in a surprisingly decent voice when she was fussy and would not settle. Lisa watched this happening and felt her heart opening in ways she had not expected. She had loved her husband deeply and his death had broken something inside her. She had not thought she would want to let anyone else into that space he left behind, but Jake was not trying to replace anyone. He was just being himself, a good man who cared about a woman and her baby because that was the kind of person he was. One evening, about 2 months into the journey, Lisa asked Jake directly what was happening between them. They were in her quarters and Emma had just fallen asleep after her bedtime routine. Jake had stayed to help as he often did now. He looked at Lisa with those tired blue eyes and admitted he did not know exactly, but he knew how he felt. He said he cared about both of them more than he had cared about anything in a long time. He said being with them made him feel alive again after years of just going through the motions. Lisa told him she felt the same way, but she was scared. Scared of being hurt again, scared of letting Emma get attached to someone who might leave, scared of moving too fast or not fast enough. Jake understood all of that because he was scared too. His daughter's death had nearly destroyed him, and the idea of caring that much again was terrifying. But he said being scared was not a good enough reason to push away something that might be wonderful. They agreed to take things slowly and see where it went. There was no rush and no pressure. They had time to figure out what they were to each other. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, making official something that had been building since the moment Jake pulled Lisa and Emma from the failing cryopod. The other Meridian survivors noticed and approved. Kate told Lisa she thought Jake was one of the good ones and Lisa should hold on to him. Patricia said it was nice to see something positive come out of all the horror they had been through. Even Captain Ross, who was not known for being sentimental, mentioned that Jake and Lisa seemed good for each other. As New Portland came into view on the Valiant screens, the survivors gathered to look at their new home. The colony was still young, only established for about 5 years, but it was growing steadily. They could see the main settlement from orbit, a cluster of buildings and domes spread across a valley near a large river. The planet itself was beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents and white clouds swirling through the atmosphere. Captain Lane called a meeting with all the Meridian survivors to discuss their options. He explained that New Portland needed skilled workers in almost every field. There were positions available in agriculture, engineering, medical care, education, construction, and resource management. The colony would provide housing and supplies for the first 6 months while people got established. After that, everyone would be expected to contribute and support themselves. The survivors talked among themselves about what they wanted to do. Most of them decided to stay together as much as possible. They had been through too much to just scatter and lose touch. Patricia was offered a position running a medical clinic, and she accepted immediately. Gary, recovered from his collapse, joined the engineering team that maintained the colony's infrastructure. Kate and Danny moved into family housing, and Kate started working in colony administration. Amy, the teacher, was hired to help with the colony school. Lisa was offered the position of head botanist, responsible for overseeing all agricultural operations. It was a huge job with significant responsibility, but the colony leaders had heard about her work on the Meridian and wanted her expertise. She accepted on the condition that she could bring Emma to work with her when needed. They agreed without hesitation. Jake joined the engineering division, but he also became something else. He started working with the colonial administration on safety protocols and emergency systems. He testified about what happened on the Meridian and pushed for changes that would prevent future tragedies. His burned hands became a symbol in the advocacy work, a visible reminder of the price people paid when safety systems failed. As the Valiant prepared to land, Jake came to find Lisa in her quarters. Emma was playing with blocks on the floor, babbling to herself happily. Jake knelt down beside the baby and she immediately crawled over to him, pulling herself up using his knee for support. He steadied her carefully and looked up at Lisa with an expression she had never seen before. He told her he wanted to make this official. He wanted to be part of their family for real, not just someone who hung around and helped out. He wanted to be there for Emma's first words and first steps and first everything. He wanted to build a life with them on New Portland, to have a home together and make new memories that were not about dying ships and failing cryopods. Lisa felt tears running down her face as she nodded yes. She had been hoping he would say something like this, but had not wanted to push or assume. Emma looked up at both of them and laughed like she understood something important was happening. Jake stood up with Emma in his arms and kissed Lisa for the first time, gentle and sweet and full of promise for the future they would build together. New Portland welcomed the Meridian survivors with open arms and genuine compassion. The colonists had heard the story of what happened, and they treated the newcomers as heroes, though none of the survivors felt like heroes. They felt like people who had done what needed to be done to stay alive. But the colony's warmth and acceptance helped them begin to truly heal from the trauma they had experienced. Lisa threw herself into her work with the intensity of someone who needed purpose to process what she had been through. The agricultural division was struggling with crop yields that were lower than projected. The soil chemistry was slightly off and the local climate had unexpected variations. These were exactly the kinds of problems Lisa excelled at solving. She spent long days in the fields and greenhouses, testing and adjusting and teaching the other workers techniques she had learned both in school and during the crisis on the Meridian. Within 3 months, crop yields increased by 30%. Within 6 months, Lisa had introduced 3 new crops that thrived in New Portland's conditions. The colony leadership praised her work, and other colonists started coming to her with questions about their personal gardens. She became known as the person who could make anything grow, even in difficult conditions. Emma grew and changed rapidly as babies do. She took her first steps in the main colony habitat, toddling between Lisa and Jake, while a dozen Meridian survivors watched and cheered. Her first clear word was Jake's name, which made him cry happy tears that he tried to hide. She learned to say mama and food and more, and no with equal enthusiasm. She was surrounded by adults who all considered themselves her family, the Meridian, survivors who had fought to keep her alive and now celebrated every milestone she reached. Jake made good on his promise to be there for everything. He was present for Emma's first birthday party, which became a gathering of all the Meridian survivors to mark not just Emma's birthday but their own survival. He was there when Emma got sick with a minor fever and Lisa panicked, holding them both while Patricia examined Emma and assured them it was just a normal childhood bug. He was there for bedtime stories and morning routines and everything in between. But Jake's most important work was happening in the colony administration building. He had compiled a detailed report on the Meridian disaster, documenting every system failure and every decision made during the crisis. He presented this report to the Colonial Safety Board and pushed for mandatory changes in how civilian transport ships were maintained and operated. His testimony was powerful and personal, and it led to new regulations that would affect every ship in the colonial fleet. Jake's advocacy work caught the attention of officials beyond New Portland. He was invited to speak at colonial conferences and safety summits. He traveled occasionally to other settlements to share his experience and push for better emergency protocols. Each time he left, Lisa and Emma went with him. They had become a unit, a family that moved through life together. The other Meridian survivors built their own lives but stayed connected to each other in important ways. They gathered once a week for communal dinners, taking turns hosting and cooking. They supported each other through nightmares and anxiety, and the complicated process of moving forward after trauma. They celebrated together when good things happened and grieved together when memories became too heavy. Kate and Danny thrived in their new life. Danny started school and made friends quickly, though he stayed close to his mother in ways that showed the crisis had affected him. Kate began dating a man from the colony security team, and the Meridian survivors all approved of him after subjecting him to thorough questioning. Patricia's medical clinic became a center of community health, and she trained 2 young colonists as nurses to help with the workload. Gary recovered fully from his collapse and became the chief maintenance engineer for the colony's central systems. He implemented redundancy protocols based on what he learned during the Meridian crisis, making sure New Portland would not face the same kinds of cascade failures. Amy expanded the colony school and started an art program where children learned to express themselves creatively. On the first anniversary of their rescue, the Meridian survivors organized a memorial service. They gathered in a garden that Lisa had designed and planted specifically for this purpose. The garden held 63 trees, 1 for each survivor. But it also had 237 flowering bushes, 1 for each person who had not made it. Lisa made sure that garden thrived, that it was the most beautiful spot in the entire colony. The memorial service was simple, but profound. Captain Ross spoke about the people they had lost and the difficult choices everyone had to make. Patricia read the names of those who died, taking time with each one to honor their memory. Jake talked about the importance of remembering both the tragedy and the triumph, the deaths and the survival. He said they owed it to those who died to live full good lives, to make their survival meaningful. Emma, now walking confidently and chattering in her toddler language, placed flowers on several of the memorial bushes with Lisa's help. The adults watched with tears streaming down their faces. This child who had been wrapped in blankets and nearly frozen to death was now healthy and happy and alive. She represented everything they had fought for, everything that made the struggle worthwhile. After the formal service ended, the survivors stayed in the garden talking and sharing memories. Some stories were sad, remembering loved ones lost, but many stories were about the amazing things people did during the crisis, the moments of kindness and courage and humor, even in terrible circumstances. They remembered the elderly couple who gave up their cryopod. They remembered the children making art in the shelters. They remembered sharing the last of their food and water without hesitation. As evening came and people started to leave, Jake and Lisa stayed in the garden with Emma. The toddler was picking flowers and bringing them to her parents with proud declarations. Jake put his arm around Lisa and pulled her close. They stood together watching their daughter play among the memorial bushes, alive and free under New Portland's sunset. Lisa thought about that moment in the failing cryopod when she had wrapped Emma in blankets and closed her eyes, certain they would both die. She thought about waking to warmth and safety because a stranger decided they were worth saving. She thought about the impossible journey from that moment to this one, standing in a beautiful garden on a new world with a family she had not expected to find. Jake seemed to know what she was thinking because he kissed the top of her head and said they had made it. They had survived and built something new and good from the ashes of tragedy. Lisa agreed and called Emma over. The 3 of them stood, together as the sun set, a family forged in crisis and strengthened by love, ready to face whatever the future held. 2 years after arriving at New Portland, Lisa and Jake stood in the Colony Administrative Center waiting for an official ceremony to begin. Emma, now almost 3 years old, sat between them playing with a small toy ship that Jake had made for her. The room was filled with colonists and officials from several other settlements. News cameras were set up in the back, broadcasting to colonies across 3 star systems. Today, the colonial administration was officially adopting the new safety regulations that Jake had fought for since the Meridian disaster. The regulations would require better maintenance schedules for all civilian transport ships, improved cryopod technology with multiple redundant systems, and mandatory emergency protocols that every crew member had to know. It had taken 2 years of testimony and lobbying and pushing against bureaucracy, but the changes were finally happening. Administrator Chen, the head of the Colonial Safety Board, called Jake up to the podium. Jake squeezed Lisa's hand and walked to the front of the room. His scarred hands were visible as he adjusted the microphone, a permanent reminder of the price paid during those desperate days on the Meridian. He spoke clearly and with emotion about why these changes mattered, about the 237 people who died because systems failed and backup plans did not exist. But Jake also talked about the 63 who survived, about the human capacity to adapt and overcome and refuse to give up. He said the new regulations honored both the dead and the living by making sure future travelers would be safer. He talked about the elderly couple who gave up their cryopod and the children who made art in the shelters, and the parents who shared their last food with hungry babies. He said that was the spirit they needed to carry forward, the willingness to sacrifice for each other and fight for survival together. When Jake finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Emma clapped her hands too, not understanding what was happening but knowing her Jake had done something important. Administrator Chen signed the regulations into law right there, using a pen that would be donated to the New Portland Museum afterward. She presented Jake with a medal for his advocacy work, though he accepted it reluctantly, and later said he did not feel like he deserved medals for doing what anyone should have done. After the ceremony, reporters wanted to interview Lisa and Jake about their experience. They had done interviews before but never enjoyed them. The reporters always wanted dramatic stories about near-death experiences and hard choices. They wanted to focus on the horror and tragedy. Lisa and Jake tried to shift the focus to the community that formed among the survivors, to the strength and compassion that emerged during the crisis. One reporter asked Lisa what it felt like to nearly freeze to death with her baby in a failing cryopod. Lisa took a deep breath and gave her standard answer. She said it felt like the end of everything, but also like the beginning of understanding what really mattered. She said holding Emma in that moment made her fight harder than she had ever fought for anything. She said waking up to find a stranger had saved them both taught her that humans were capable of extraordinary kindness. The reporter turned to Jake and asked why he chose to save Lisa and Emma instead of saving himself. Jake looked uncomfortable with the question as he always did. He explained again that it was not about choosing them specifically, it was about saving who he could reach. He said any decent person would have done the same thing. The reporter pushed back, saying most people would have focused on their own survival. Jake's response was firm and a little angry. He said if that was true, then humans did not deserve to survive, but he believed most people were better than that when tested. Emma got restless during the interviews and started fussing. Lisa picked her up and excused them from the reporters, taking Emma outside for some fresh air. Jake followed a few minutes later, having politely but firmly ended the interview session. They walked through the colony together with Emma between them, holding both their hands. She had recently become obsessed with jumping over cracks in the pavement, and they had to stop every few steps to let her jump. They ended up at the memorial garden, where they often came when they needed to think or remember. The garden had grown beautifully over 2 years. The trees were taller and the flowering bushes bloomed in rotation, so there was always color. Colonists came here to relax and reflect, and it had become a peaceful center point of the settlement. Emma ran ahead to look at the flowers, chattering to herself in the half-formed sentences of a toddler. Jake sat on a bench and Lisa joined him, both of them watching Emma play. Jake said he was glad the regulations passed, but he felt strange being celebrated for it. Lisa understood what he meant. The Meridian survivors never felt comfortable being called heroes. They had just done what needed to be done. But she pointed out that pushing for change took a different kind of courage, the kind that involved fighting bureaucracy and reliving trauma over and over in testimony. That was heroic even if it felt ordinary to him. Kate and Danny appeared in the garden, walking the path that circled the memorial. They waved and came over to join Lisa and Jake. Danny was almost 13 now, tall and serious but still carrying himself like someone who had seen too much too young. He was doing well in school and had recently expressed interest in becoming an engineer like Jake. Kate had married her boyfriend from the security team 6 months ago and seemed genuinely happy. They talked about the ceremony and the new regulations. Kate said it felt good to know something positive had come from the tragedy. Danny asked Jake technical questions about the new cryopod requirements, showing the kind of detailed interest that suggested he really might become an engineer. Jake answered patiently, encouraging Danny's curiosity and intelligence. Patricia arrived next with Gary and Amy. Soon half the Meridian survivors were in the garden, drawn together by some unspoken understanding that today was a day to be together. They spread out on the grass and benches, talking and laughing and watching the children play. Emma had found a friend among the newer colonist children, and they were running around the garden together. Someone had brought food, and it turned into an impromptu picnic. They shared stories and memories, some funny and some sad. Gary talked about the time they rigged up a water recycling system using parts from a broken coffee maker. Amy remembered the children's art project and how it gave everyone hope. Patricia described trying to do medical procedures with almost no supplies and improvising solutions that somehow worked. Captain Ross showed up late, having flown in from her new assignment on another colony. She was semi-retired now but still consulted on crisis management protocols. She hugged everyone and settled in with a plate of food, looking more relaxed than she ever had on the Meridian. She told them she was proud of what they had built here. Not just the garden, but the community and the changes they had pushed for across the colonies. As the sun set, someone started singing an old Earth song about home and belonging. Others joined in, voices blending together in the twilight. Emma climbed into Lisa's lap and fell asleep, exhausted from playing. Jake put his arm around both of them and Lisa leaned into his warmth, feeling safe and content in ways she had not thought possible 3 years ago. This was what they had fought for during those desperate days on the dying ship. Not just survival, but the chance to build lives worth living. Not just staying alive, but creating meaning from tragedy. Not just making it through, but carrying forward the lessons learned, and making sure others would not have to face the same dangers. They were more than survivors now. They were builders and advocates and teachers. They were a family, not just Lisa and Jake and Emma, but all 63 people who had refused to die. They were proof that humans could face impossible odds and come through stronger. They were living examples of why humanity deserved its place among the stars. The singing faded and people started to leave, heading home to families and beds and normal lives that felt miraculous to those who almost lost everything. Lisa and Jake stayed a little longer with Emma asleep between them, looking at the memorial garden they would maintain for the rest of their lives. They would never forget the Meridian or the people who died or the choices that had to be made, but they would also never stop moving forward, building and growing and living with intention and gratitude. 5 years after the Meridian disaster, New Portland had grown into a thriving colony of over 3,000 people. The settlement had expanded beyond the original valley to include farms and research stations and small satellite communities. Lisa's agricultural programs fed not just New Portland, but 2 neighboring colonies as well. Jake's safety work had influenced policy across the entire colonial network. The memorial garden had become a place of pilgrimage for people from other worlds who wanted to pay respects and learn the story. Emma was 7 years old now, attending the colony school and showing signs of inheriting both her mother's way with plants and her father's mechanical aptitude. She did not remember the Meridian crisis, of course, being far too young when it happened, but she grew up hearing the stories and understanding that her life had been saved by people who refused to give up. That knowledge shaped her in ways both obvious and subtle, making her compassionate and brave and aware that life was precious. Lisa and Jake had married 3 years earlier, in a ceremony attended by all the Meridian survivors and half the colony. It was a joyful celebration that doubled as a reunion for the survivors who had scattered to different settlements. They all still stayed in touch through regular video calls and messages, maintaining the bonds forged during those desperate days. But gathering in person remained special and meaningful. The Meridian itself had been recovered and towed to a shipyard where it was studied extensively. Engineers examined every failed system and documented exactly what went wrong. The ship would never fly again, but it served an important purpose as a training tool, teaching new engineers and crew members what could go wrong and how to prevent it. Jake had consulted on the analysis and found it difficult but necessary to walk through the ship again, seeing the shelters where they had huddled for warmth and the cryo bay where so many had died. On this particular morning, Lisa was in her office at the agricultural center when she received a message that made her stop and stare at the screen. It was from the Meridian Memorial Foundation, an organization created by survivors and victims' families to honor those lost and educate others about crisis survival. They were planning a major event for the 5-year anniversary and wanted Lisa to speak. More specifically, They wanted her to speak to a group of school children from across multiple colonies about what happened and what it taught her. Lisa's first instinct was to refuse, as it always was when asked to speak publicly. She did not like being in the spotlight, and she worried about exploiting tragedy for attention. But then she thought about Emma and all the other children who would grow up traveling between stars. If her story could teach them something valuable, did she have a right to stay silent? She called Jake and they talked it through together. He had struggled with similar requests over the years and understood her hesitation. But he pointed out that their experience was not just their own. It belonged in some way to everyone who might face similar dangers. Sharing what they learned could literally save lives in the future. Lisa agreed to do it on the condition that Jake would be there with her, and that they could bring some of the other survivors to share the story more completely. The memorial event was held in New Portland's main assembly hall, which was packed with people. Survivors and their families sat together in the front rows. Behind them were colonists and visitors from other settlements. A whole section was reserved for school children who had been studying the Meridian disaster as part of their curriculum. News cameras broadcast the event to colonies across known space. The program began with Captain Ross reading the names of those who died, just as she had at every anniversary memorial. It took nearly 20 minutes to read all 237 names, and the room was silent except for her voice. When she finished, a choir of colony children sang a song that Amy had written about loss and remembrance and hope. Emma was in the choir, and Lisa felt tears streaming down her face watching her daughter honor people she had never known. Then it was time for the survivors to speak. Patricia went first, talking about the medical challenges and how people supported each other through injury and illness. Gary talked about keeping the failing systems running through improvisation and teamwork. Kate and Danny spoke together about being a family surviving crisis and how it changed their relationship. Amy discussed the children's art project and why maintaining hope and normalcy mattered even in desperate circumstances. When it was Lisa's turn, she walked to the podium with her hands shaking. Emma gave her an encouraging thumbs up from the choir section. Jake nodded from his seat in the front row. Lisa took a breath and began to speak, not from prepared notes, but from the heart about what she remembered and what it meant. She talked about the moment she wrapped Emma in blankets and climbed into the failing cryopod, accepting death but praying her daughter might somehow survive. She talked about waking to warmth and realizing a stranger had saved them both. She talked about watching people share their last resources without hesitation and refuse to abandon anyone who could be saved. She talked about plants growing in terrible conditions because people cared for them, about children making art in the dark, about engineers working until their bodies gave out to keep others alive. But mostly, Lisa talked about what it meant to be human when everything else was stripped away. She said humans were not the strongest species or the smartest or the toughest. What made humans special was the choice to care for each other, even when it cost them everything. It was the willingness to fight for strangers and share with competitors, and sacrifice for children who were not their own. It was the stubborn refusal to give up on each other even when giving up would be easier. Lisa looked directly at the school children in the audience when she said this next part. She told them they would face challenges in their lives, maybe not as dramatic as a failing ship, but challenges nonetheless. When those moments came, they should remember that they came from people who survived impossible things. They should remember that humans were capable of extraordinary courage and compassion. They should remember that keeping each other warm, literally and figuratively, was what humanity did best. When Lisa finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. She returned to her seat feeling emotionally drained but also lighter somehow, as if sharing the story had lessened its weight. Jake took her hand and squeezed it. Emma waved from the choir section with a huge, proud smile on her face. Jake spoke next, keeping his remarks brief as always. He talked about the specific technical failures that led to the disaster and the changes implemented since then. But he ended with something more personal. He said the Meridian taught him that life was about more than just surviving. It was about finding meaning in the survival, about using the second chance to build something good. He said he had found that meaning in his family and his work and his community, and he hoped everyone listening would find their own meaning in whatever challenges they faced. The event concluded with the unveiling of a new monument in the memorial garden. It was a sculpture of 3 figures, a woman holding a baby while a man sheltered them both, representing the moment that had become symbolic of the entire crisis. The sculpture was titled simply, Warmth, and it stood at the center of the garden where everyone could see it. After the official program ended, people milled around talking and sharing stories. Lisa found herself surrounded by teachers wanting to know more about crisis education. Jake was cornered by engineering students asking technical questions. Emma played with the other children, oblivious to the significance of the day but happy to be part of the community. As evening fell, the Meridian survivors gathered in the memorial garden one more time. This had become their tradition at every anniversary, this private time together after the public remembrances. They sat under the trees they had planted 5 years ago, now grown tall and strong. They did not talk much, just sat together in comfortable silence punctuated by occasional memories shared and acknowledged. Lisa looked around at these people who had become her family. She thought about how strange life was, how tragedy could lead to unexpected blessings if you survived it. She would give anything to undo the Meridian disaster, to bring back the people who died. But she could not deny that her life now, the family and community she had found, came directly from that terrible experience. Jake seemed to read her thoughts as he often did. He said quietly that they honored the dead by living well, by building good lives and helping others and refusing to waste the chance they were given. Lisa agreed and added that they also honored the dead by remembering them honestly, not as abstract statistics but as real people with names and families and futures that were stolen. Emma came running over with flowers she had picked, presenting them to Lisa and Jake with serious ceremony. She said she wanted to put flowers on the memorial bushes for the people who did not get to meet her, but would have loved her. Lisa helped her daughter place the flowers carefully, one on each of several bushes chosen seemingly at random, but with the confidence of a 7-year-old on an important mission. The other survivors added their own flowers until the memorial garden was covered in blooms. Then they stood together as the sun set. 63 people who had faced death,